Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzieh Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, after the United States has had troops in Afghanistan for more than 18 years, is it possible that we're nearing the end of the American occupation in that country? Washington and the Taliban have reached a tentative peace agreement, and the Americans say they will start withdrawing their troops within 135 days. What does it all mean? And will Washington really leave Afghanistan? Will join us right now in this debate as we take a look at this latest turn in Afghanistan. We're going to start it off in Kabul with Press TV's correspondent, Amin Alami, to bring us up to date on the latest and what is being said about this agreement. Amin.
Well, finally, and after 18 years of breathtaking negotiations between the U.S. and Taliban militants, both sides have agreed to sign a peace agreement in order to pave the way for what is said an intra-Afghan dialogue and a ceasefire that will lead the country to a long-lasting peace and security. In the meantime, the contents of the agreement shows that the main demand of the Taliban militant group, is the withdrawal of all foreign troops from Afghanistan. And this has been proved and confirmed by U.S. officials that all U.S. and NATO troops will withdraw from Afghanistan within 14 months. Instead, the Taliban's commitment, one of the Taliban's commitments, is to prevent the use of Afghan soil against the security of U.S. and its allies. However, making efforts to pave the way for holding an intra-Afghan dialogue to bring peace and stability in this country is also considered as one of the other parts of the contents of this peace agreement between the U.S. and Taliban militant group that was signed in Qatari capital Doha. However, the Afghan government and particularly Afghanistan's presidential palace coincide with the ceremony of signing peace agreement between U.S. and Taliban in Qatar. Was the host of NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, as well as the U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper. They both attended a joint press conference with the Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani, and they had their own words. For instance, the Afghan President Mohammad Ashraf Ghani said that the agenda of Kabul for negotiation with the Taliban has some differences with the agenda of U.S. During its negotiations with the Taliban side. Ashraf Ghani also stressed that Taliban should be ready to discuss about their state and non-state sponsors, and they need to cut their ties with their sponsors and say yes to political solutions to put an end to violence and bloodshed in this country. But let's not forget that people of Afghanistan, political leaders and even media workers have also their own viewpoint regarding to this recent move by the U.S. and Taliban. Okay. They widely welcome the move, but they also have their own concerns. For instance, they are not sure if the Taliban will approve the issues such as women's rights, freedom of speech and freedom of press.
Okay, thank you so much, Amin, for that update out of Kabul. Press TV's correspondent on the ground there, Amin Alami. I'd like to welcome my guest now to this debate, political commentator Brian Downing out of Florida, and senior research fellow Global Policy Institute George Szamuely out of Budapest. Starting it off now in Florida with Brian. Do you think that this peace agreement has anything to do with the elections in the United States coming up in November, since withdrawing troops from Afghanistan was one of Donald Trump's campaign promises 4 years ago?
I think the President Trump has been eager to get out of Afghanistan. The timing, it probably has nudged him a little bit. He can go ahead to the American people in the next few months, perhaps, and say, promises kept. That's his line, promises kept. I pulled the troops out of Afghanistan. Is it going to help him? I think it would be a minor plus, but not a huge one. Not really.
Do you think the details from what you have seen about the agreement, do you think the details have been worked out, or was it something that was expedited? Staying with you, Brian.
Well, the details are sort of to be determined later. I think the details are the United States that we have now are that the U.S. and Western troops will leave. As your correspondent rightly pointed out, the issue of freedom of speech, women, that's going to be a pretty tough subject, and it's going to be very tough for Kabul and any outside power to enforce on the Taliban. I think they're going to expect more or less complete autonomy in many parts of the southwest and east of the country.
Okay.
But even there, go ahead.
All right, stay with me. I just want to get George in on this conversation. George, what is your perspective about the inking of this peace agreement and, in general, the peace agreement itself?
Well, as you rightly pointed out, this does have something to do with the U.S. election. I mean, Donald Trump is going into a election campaign with no foreign policy successes whatsoever. His North Korea initiative is going nowhere. His maximum pressure campaign against Iran is going nowhere. His promise to improve relations with Russia is going nowhere. His threat to topple the government of Venezuela is going nowhere. His promise to withdraw from Syria is going nowhere. So the list goes on and on. This would be at least something that he could tout as a success. And of course, it does give him a flexibility because it's a 14-month window in which the U.S. Troops are to withdraw. So this is, we're into March now, so 14 months, that gives him until May of next year. So while he could boast of a great success in negotiating this agreement during the campaign, he can always renege on it after the election and not go ahead with the full withdrawal of U.S. forces. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's no question that he would like to do that. I mean, all presidents have wanted to do that. Obama wanted to do it as well. However, one always had to take U.S. promises to withdraw with a great deal of a pinch of salt because, remember, we already had one withdrawal from Iraq, and then in no time at all, U.S. troops were back in Iraq, and they don't want to leave Iraq at all. Okay. So one has to be very wary of these promises of full withdrawal from a country. All
right. Well, Brian, the U.S. under President George W. Bush started this war in 2001, saying it was a war against terrorism. How successful has the United States been in Afghanistan in more than 18 years being there now?
Pretty badly. The war was begun to fight al-Qaeda, and it quickly became a war against the Taliban as the old Taliban and many of their tribal supporters opposed the American presence. Al-Qaeda is still there. Al-Qaeda operates in eastern Afghanistan in a remote mountainous area where they are aligned with the local honor tribes of the region. They've intermarried. They have support from Pakistan. They have cohorts with the Lashkar-e-Taiba and a handful of other groups. So Al-Qaeda is still there. The idea of modernizing the country, democratizing the country, weaning it away from opium production, well, that's never happened, and it's not going to. The English author George Orwell once said that some ideas were so preposterous that only a highly educated person could believe them. By which he meant that, or to apply it here, it means if you read a bunch of reports, intelligence essays, and hear a bunch of lectures saying that we can do all these things in Afghanistan, you can actually start to believe it. But to me, I just saw a landlocked country that was backed by Pakistan, and the Taliban was always going to have safe havens there. So it was a preposterous thing.
So, well, George, I mean, looking at this again, almost 2 decades in the making now, we have various reports about the number of civilians who've been killed. Around 100,000 people have been killed in some of these reports. And so what? As our guest in Florida said, Al-Qaeda is still there in the mountains. The U.S. talking to the Taliban has signed now a possible peace agreement with them. So what has been accomplished, and who is going to pay for these hundreds of thousands of lives, death, destruction, and damage that has been done in Afghanistan?
Well, the answer, of course, is that no one's going to pay. That's just not the way things work. I mean, the United States paid nothing to Vietnam after the signing of the Paris Accords in 1973. So even though it promised to do so, there'll be no payment whatsoever. The interesting thing about this agreement is not so much Al-Qaeda, but the insistence that there be no terrorist forces on Afghan soil that might do harm in the United States.
Yes, and I was going to get to that, actually. One of the main points of this agreement, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. And that's all really the United States is concerned about. Don't foster terrorists that might do harm to us. You can foster terrorists that do harm to others, but not against us. I mean, if these are terrorists who will go and fight in Syria, or they'll go into Central Asia, Russian Central Asia, and do some fighting there, that's okay. But just don't sponsor terrorists who will do harm to us. That's the key part of this agreement. So the problem is that the United States never really had an honest global war on terror. It was more a matter of organizing terror groups to fight perceived adversaries of the United States. And so, that's why, in the name of global war on terror, whom did the United States attack? Saddam Hussein, who was an enemy of Al-Qaeda, Muammar Gaddafi, an enemy of Al-Qaeda, Iran, an enemy of Al-Qaeda, Bashar al-Assad, an enemy of Al-Qaeda. So there really hasn't been any proper war against Al-Qaeda. All they want is we don't want some crazies who suddenly turn against us in the way Osama bin Laden did, because bin Laden had been a U.S. ally for a long time in Afghanistan and then subsequently Bosnia, but something went wrong and he turned against the United States. The United States just doesn't want that to happen again. And that's really, that's the key part of the agreement. And I'm sure the Taliban say, okay, fine, we won't sponsor terrorists who'll do harm to you. We'll just sponsor terrorists who'll do harm to others.
Well, Brian, what about that? Let me read this part of the agreement that George has just alluded to. It says guarantees and enforcement mechanisms that will prevent the use of the soil of Afghanistan by any group or individual against the security of the United States and its allies. So your take on that, what exactly does that mean for Afghanistan as far as a sovereign country and deciding whichever direction they want to go into, and what does it mean for the region?
Well, as I said, there's that group of Al-Qaeda and Lashkar-e-Taiba that are backed by Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. They're in mountainous fortresses. You're not going to go in there. You could inflict casualties, but fully expelling them, I don't think it'll happen. However, inside Afghanistan in various places, there are ISIL cells operating. The Taliban don't like them, by and large. Some Taliban forces, and remember, the Taliban isn't any single thing. It's a conglomeration of various feudal, tribal militias. But for the most part, the Taliban doesn't like ISIL there, and they have been fighting them. And the United States has been delivering airstrikes on ISIL and ISIS. By no means suggesting that the U.S. and the Taliban are cooperating, but they do have the common enemy in ISIL. ISIL, I think, can be eliminated from Afghanistan or reduced to near insignificance. They've lost a lot of their significance in Afghanistan once they lost their land holdings in Syria and Iraq. You saw a lot of the Al-Qaeda and Lashkar-e-Taiba fighters drifting off to ISIL units to fight when ISIL seemed like the bringer of the new caliphate. But once they collapsed, ISIL lost a lot of its support. My understanding from intelligence people is that Saudi Arabia is backing the ISIL forces in Afghanistan. They want ISIL to gather all the various discontented groups and direct them against, you guessed it, Iran to the west. That's not going on, though.
Well, George, the Taliban and the Afghan government do not see eye to eye. Now, do you think that the upcoming, because this is part of the agreement, intra-Afghan talks will be able to actually bring the two sides closer together? Will we ultimately just see the Taliban totally ruling Afghanistan, as they do control the majority of the landmass even today?
Well, I have to say that I doubt whether they'll come to any kind of an agreement. And the deal between the United States and Taliban doesn't really stipulate that they should have to do anything, you know, set up a coalition government, join forces together, or anything at all. All they need to do is pledge that there'll be some kind of a negotiations on a permanent ceasefire. I doubt whether any serious negotiations are going to take place. And I imagine that the fighting will continue, and probably the Taliban will win out. But it won't be right away, because the United States will continue to arm the Afghan government. So it'll be a slow process in which the war will go on. But I think the Taliban, as you say, does control most of the territory. And it obviously enjoys greater public support than the Afghan government, and that eventually I think the Taliban will win out.
Well, the Taliban actually now today, with the agreement calling itself the Islamic Emirate Afghanistan, and we look at even the name right there, and of course the Afghan government disagrees even with starting out with that name and even recognizing it. So in your opinion, Brian, what type of obstacles do you think is on the way in really being able to implement this peace agreement?
Well, hammering out the details, who controls what, who gets money, that's going to be a big thing. In Afghanistan's most peaceful, prosperous times, the situation has been that the Kabul government had very little influence out in the country. They just used foreign money to make deals with various tribes and ethnic groups. I think that's the optimal situation here, that outside money, possibly the United States, but I would like to see it shift to China, Russia, and other powers, that they're going to give Kabul money. And Kabul will negotiate with various ethnic groups, including the Taliban movement. Say, well, we'll give you a heck of a lot of money if you just sort of cool it. Now, let's also bear in mind that the Taliban could face a lot of desertions once the fighting stops. That was the case with the Afghan war back in the 80s. Once the Soviet Union pulled out, most of the guerrilla leaders, most of the guerrilla fighters said, well, mission accomplished, let's go home. And I think you could see that with a lot of the Taliban forces. They could just go home. Mm-hmm. And that will greatly weaken them. Remember, okay, as I said, the Taliban isn't one great conglomerate. It's a bunch of tribal levies patched out with deals and money. And with peace, if there is a peace, I think you'll see a lot of them go home.
Well, George, does this agreement mean that a group that the U.S. declared war against, of course, forced Al-Qaeda, but then started fighting the Taliban 18 years ago, has totally changed? And will they now protect U.S. interests in Afghanistan? How do you see this working?
I would doubt that they would protect U.S. interests, given the extent of the celebrations taking place today. And they're rejoicing that finally the U.S. is leaving, finally Afghanistan is independent. It doesn't sound like there's a great deal of love lost between the Taliban and the U.S. The Taliban will continue with its Islamicization campaign. I mean, that's what it's about. And I think it does want to rule the country. I mean, it did rule the country once. It was overthrown, and it seems to me unlikely that they would just tolerate the state of affairs in which there's a government in Kabul recognized internationally that is recipient of funds from the United States or China or whoever, while the Taliban is just struggling in the countryside. I think they will want to rule the country. Maybe initially through some form of a coalition government. That seems very unlikely. But I doubt whether they would just simply accept Kabul as as somehow the legal, legitimate government of Afghanistan.
And Brian, in your perspective, what has to happen in order for peace to become a reality now in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the Taliban has to confine its ambitions to the regions they already control in the south and in the east. Remember that the rest of the country pretty much despises the Taliban. And also bear in mind that those other groups, the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, are very much backed by Iran. When the United States sent troops into Afghanistan to support the Northern Alliance, who did they meet? They met IRGC officers, and they cooperated, shared intelligence, led to joint operations. Russia doesn't want to see the Taliban grow any stronger along their southern area. And I think China really wants stability in the area so they can get all the copper, iron, and coal and oil and gas out of the country that they can. They also want Afghanistan to become sort of the roadway between Central Asia and ports on the Arabian Sea in Iran and also in Pakistan.
So are you optimistic? 30 seconds, George, are you optimistic that peace is on its way to Afghanistan and that the Americans will be leaving?
No, I'm not. I mean, the Taliban has achieved an enormous amount. It has prevailed against the might of the United States. For 18 years ago, they were toppled, thrown out of power, yet they've survived. They've managed to fight the United States off. They're not just going to now give up and say, oh, well, we're off now and we're not interested anymore. No, they want complete power. And I think the war between the Taliban and the government in Kabul will continue.
And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with us on this debate. Political commentator Brian Downing out of Florida, Senior Research Fellow, Global Policy Institute, George Szamuely out of Budapest. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you next time.